We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell. Hello and welcome to the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast, which is all about women and how to make our finances that bit fitter. I'm Danni, and this episode I'm joined by two brilliant members of the Money Matters team, Charlene and Rachel. Hi both.
Hello.
Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me for this episode, because it's one that's going to take us right back to the beginning with some new research that we've carried out looking into the gender investment gap, specifically the gender pension gap. Now, for regular listeners, you'll know that this is something that I'm really passionate about, and it's something that came to me much later in my career than you two. I think that means that we've got the best of both worlds right here, because when we're talking about this really important issue, women are just as engaged with men with their retirement plans and their pension pots as we get into our 50s and outside the retirement sector, though that there is a bit of a disconnect. And I was really guilty of this when I was much younger. So let's go right back to the beginning, ladies. And Charlene, can you just kick us off explaining what the gap between what men have in their pension pots and what women have in theirs?
Yeah, thanks, Danni. I think, as you say, take it back to the beginning, and I'll probably go back a stage there from pots, as the gap in my kind of view can be defined in a number of different ways. Yes, absolutely, in terms of what people have, men versus women in their pots at different stages as they're approaching that time that maybe they want to access them. But ultimately, our pots are there to give us an income in later life as we move from the world of work to whatever retirement looks like for us. So there's also state pension income and potential gaps, perhaps more in the past, that one to consider too. So if we are talking in terms of a pension pot gap, HMRC data revealed that the average private pension value for people aged 55 to 59 between 2020 and 2022 was for men £156,000 and just over £81,000 for women, so almost half as much. So that's pretty stark. And I think, talking about converting that to income, very sort of ballpark figures, that might pay that man around £11,000 a year if you were to get something called an annuity, fixed income for life, or £6,000 a year for women there. So a gap there of around £5,000 a year less. Now, why does this matter beyond kind of equality, if you like? Because we have equality in the pension ages for men and women. So both in the private space, when we can access our own savings, which will be 57 from the year 2028, and age 67 for most people for the state pension for now. But, as we know, women have a longer life expectancy. So any retirement savings they have need to last them longer, around about 3 years longer based on average life expectancies at the moment.
So let's go right back to the beginning when people are starting out with their early careers. Is there then, Rachel, a difference between how men and women are thinking when it comes to both their pay and their pension payments?
Well, let's start off with pay, Danni, because pay is a really important part of the whole conversation when we're talking about the gender pensions gap. The amount of money that you put into a pension is dependent on how much you earn. It's usually a straight percentage of your pay. So the more that you earn, the bigger your pension contribution will be. So the gender pensions gap might come, and does come, from the gender pay gap. So let's start off by looking at the differences between how men and women are paid. So when you're starting off and you're in your early 20s, then men and women are being paid roughly about the same amount of money. Men are very slightly up on women, but there's really not much in it. And I've seen various bits of research about this, and even in some industries, women get paid more than men on average, which is, well, in my lifetime, that's unheard of. So it's really interesting that they're coming at it really quite equal. When we looked at our customers and people who are paying into AJ Bell pensions, what we saw was that at an early age, at the early 20s, men and women are putting in roughly about the same amount of money as well into their pension because their pay is very, very similar. So they're putting the same amount of money in. So very much on an equal footing. What we wanted to do then was just to look a little bit deeper. So we've commissioned some research just to ask men and women about their priorities and how they view pension planning and what's important to them. So we asked those people in their early 20s and we said, is pensions a top priority for you? Now, not unsurprising this, but in your early 20s, it's you're not going to believe this, Danny, but it's not all about the pension. It's the paper, but it's not people's top priority for some strange reason. So for men, it's 9% of men, it's pensions are their top priority. And for women, 6% of women. So women are slightly below men, not massively. It's not really anyone's top priority. But it's very interesting then when you ask them, well, what is your top priority? And for 15% of men, they say just getting by. At that age, in your early 20s, just financially getting by. But for women, that's much higher. It's 24% is higher. And I think that is because I think women are more keen to get on with their lives, get a little bit of financial independence. They want to start achieving their financial goals. For example, if you look at the number of people who are living at home in their early 20s, then that's increased quite significantly over the last 2 decades. But definitely more men live at home than women. So I think women just are maybe struggling to get by because they've got a little bit more financial independence from their parents at that age.
It's interesting because I have 2 girls who are now in their teens and they're desperate for independence. They're both, one of them is now living away at university. The other one can't wait to do it. And certainly the eldest who's away doesn't want to come back. But Charlene, I know you've got 2 boys and I've got 2 nephews and they're very different. They're real homebodies.
Yep. They are. I mean, I wouldn't take it personally, Danny. That's what I'd say to start with. But I mean, yeah, my boys are 9 and 6, and my 9-year-old has quite already clearly declared that he would love to stay at home and live with me forever, which I actually loved to hear. But I'm not sure that will play out as the years go on. I'm sure they'll get fed up of me quite soon. I just wanted to ask really quickly, Rachel. You know, we talked about the link there between pay and what you pay into your pension, because most people, obviously, as they're starting out, they're probably thinking about workplace pensions. And do you think that shows like a degree of kind of set and forget men and women at that age? Is that kind of how you think the gap might start to perpetuate, because they're sort of setting that percentage that they're given or they're told they can have and not particularly topping it up at that stage because of those competing priorities, perhaps?
I think so. I think it's really important when we look at when you start saving into a pension. Now, if we go back a few years, 5, 10, 15 years, then men may have started saving into their pension from an earlier age. But now we've got automatic enrolment into pensions, which has been going for the last 14 years now. It means that both men and women are automatically put into a pension when they join a new employer and after the age of 22. So both men and women are starting to save, are saving for a pension. And I think this is why there's no gap at this point, that they have the same amount of money, they're saving the same amount of money because they've both been enrolled into it. But it's that early age, everything is level, but it's what happens afterwards. And I think you might be right, is that what happens is that it depends how high a priority pensions is and how high a priority your retirement is to whether you actually start going, well, actually, do I need to increase my contributions? up from this minimum amount I've been set on, and have a look at maybe putting in a little bit more money. And that's certainly not, I don't think, a question that really either men or women address in their early 20s. I think they're probably just too concentrated and unfocused on just getting by and just being able to live from day to day. But when do people start then thinking maybe I should be topping up, is as an interesting question, and whether that differs for men and women.
There is a difference at that young age about how much women think they're going to need in retirement, and it's less than men at that age are already thinking that they're going to need. Why is that? What's that about?
It's slightly, yes, it is. When we looked at the figures, just give you quite a lot of figures here, but just very roughly, women thought they could survive on £1,800 a month, and men thought they would need £2,200 a month. So that in their early 20s, that's what they thought. When they get to retirement, that's what they would need. And it does show a slight difference. And I'm not entirely sure how much store I would really put on those figures at that moment in time, because I'm not too sure I've met any 23-year-olds who's really thought thoroughly through the question of how much money do I need. I'm looking forward to thinking, I'm not entirely sure I've met many 53-year-olds who've actually really given that question as much thought as it needs either, but certainly in their early 20s. But it again just shows that maybe women just underestimate how much they're going to need from their pension, and therefore that falls into I don't really need to give it that higher priority, whereas men are already starting to think, well, actually, do you know what, I'm going to need something to be self-sufficient at a later age, and this is the amount of money I'm going to need, so maybe I need to do more at an earlier age to achieve it.
Yeah, I think at that point, what stuck out, obviously there was a gap, like you say, but I think for us when we were going through it, wasn't it? It kind of stuck out that it was just a very low number all round. But like you say, early 20s, we asked in today's money, so accounting for inflation there. But yeah, I think what stuck out across the board was quite how low those expectations were, and there's nothing wrong with that, because like you say, we're talking about people in their early 20s there.
But also, I think when you're in your 20s, I do remember that the amount of cash that I needed just to get by was very different. I didn't have the same kind of outgoings, certainly not once I had kids, but just generally now I'm thinking about my retirement and the amount of money I would need in a very different way to when I was thinking in my 20s about the amount of money I needed just to get by. And one number struck me in this, Charlene, a magic number, if you will, although I guess it's not magic in terms of Disney princesses, maybe Disney villains, but 28.
Ah, yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, certainly kind of from the villain side of things, it's where we start to see women fall behind in their contributions. So when we say contributions, that's what women are paying into their pensions, or what everybody is paying into their pensions. So looking at our AJ Bell data as well, that is where we start to see this kind of trend or this gap potentially emerge because of what Rachel spoke about, because of women paying less into their pensions. Now, very quickly, just touching back on priorities, this is where we see men in particular start to zone in on retirement. So the reason I say that is because we go from kind of giving it 22% of men starting to name it as one of those priorities, whereas women still around about 8% at that point. So we start to see a gap in kind of zoning in terms of priorities, or what people told us their priorities were. And 28, actually, if you think about age 29, according to the ONS, that is the age at which women on average have their first child. Obviously, there is a bit of a spread in that, a huge life event. And like you say, a huge shift in your financial priorities as well. And, whilst this kind of pension priority gap is quite stark, the differences we start to see play out between men and women and their goals, or it goes beyond their goals, because we're talking about working patterns as well. If we think about that big life event, potentially having your first child. So, this is when those working paths or career paths start to take a bit of a diverging path, if you like, at that age. And, the pension system isn't as good as it should be as being able to cope with those different paths. People don't necessarily work in what we would call like a linear fashion. So if we think about age 28, if women are starting to think about or taking career breaks to have children, retirement and pension contributions are obviously going to slip down the pecking order. So those things aren't necessarily a surprise. But if we think about maternity leave and breaks in contributions, less money rolling into pensions means that there will ultimately be less in a woman's pot, because all that kind of heavy lifting, as we call it, is left to investment growth. What's in your pot growing? So yeah, it's where we start to see a number of things really kind of diverge and that gap start to perpetuate. And actually, one really interesting thing just to finish on there is, even as women might begin to return to work after a period of maternity leave or a different career break, many choose part-time or self-employment compared to before. So women, we asked between the age of 29 and 40, over 1 in 5 said they were working part-time, in comparison to just 5%, also 1 in 20 of men.
I think what's really interesting, Charlene, is when we looked at the research, was as you said, men and women's priorities were different, and a lot more men were looking at retirement as a priority, but women's priorities, I felt, were much more tangible. Did you get that sense as well, that they were a lot more discussion about, spending money on the children and spending money on houses and making sure that they've got that thing? And I think that's just because of looking back to when I had children, although it was quite a bit later than 28, but when I had children, it's all encompassing, isn't it? You're just trying to sometimes you're just trying to get through the day with a couple of very little ones. But it's to do with looking at the here and now, and it's a very immediate sense just at that moment in time. And I think that's why you are looking at the tangibles. You're making sure your kids have got, you've got enough money for the kids to get them the nursery fees or the toys that they need, or the holidays or whatever it happens to be. Did you get that feeling as well when you were looking at the report?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about financially getting by. I think when you have kids, getting by takes on a whole different meaning, doesn't it? Like you say, just getting through that day. So absolutely, I think, we saw that gap that you talked about in terms of expectations from what people wanted from the retirement savings started to actually close. But obviously these competing priorities really do start to kind of hold women back. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with obviously prioritizing these kind of tangible, perhaps shorter term life events. But I do think, if we're talking about people starting a family, potentially getting married, depending on what order you choose to do that in, it's really important there. And I'm sure we'll touch on this later in terms of having that household financial discussion. We are talking about a gap between men and women's pension savings, but let's be honest, we're talking about things like your mortgage, for example. You do talk about that jointly if you have bought property with somebody. So really, is that the start of having those frank conversations about what happens with your finances before you make that decision to try for children?
I think it's great now that there are so many podcasts that talk about this. You've got a lot of people on social media that will talk about this. And now women, everybody tends to talk about finances in a much different way than they did certainly when I was having kids. I was one of those mums that went back to work part-time, which meant that I had less going into my pension pot. And I'd not had a conversation at all with my husband prior to having kids about how we were going to juggle all of this. We just carried on the way that we always had. And I suddenly find that I didn't have quite as much money going into my bank account and the same amount of stuff going out. And what struck me, you were just saying that also the gap is kind of cemented in place at 28, but also at 28, because all your outgoings suddenly mushroom, you're sort of getting a bit of a sense about what you might need going forward. And that's probably why expectation of what women think they're going to need from a pension at that when they retire starts to change at that age and sort of close towards men. But by the time they're actually giving their pension savings the same priority as men, Rachel, they're in their 40s. At that point, that gap is cemented in, but really hard to recover from.
Yes, I think you're right, Danny. It's when we were looking at the research, we were looking to see where women were and when they started to really prioritise pensions, and the ages around just when you're about 40 or just over 40. So if I'm going to go back to the pensions gap, the pay gap, if I can, where I started off with all of this. Now, you remember when I said in your early 20s, it was roughly men and women were earning roughly the same. When you look at the research that the Office of National Statistics has done on this, the biggest gap is for women who are over age 40 when we're talking about the pay gap. And if they're aged between 40 and 49, the gap is 9%. Now, it was roughly about 7% on average over all ages, but at that point, when you're over 40, between 40 and 49, the gap is 9%. For women over the age of 50, the gap is 12.5%, which is really quite staggering. So, and I think a lot of this is because of women going part-time. But also, I wonder if it's also about maybe women not taking the advantage of career progression if they get offered it at sometimes. I know this is maybe a very personal comment, and I wouldn't like to say this is all women or generalize in any way whatsoever over this. But I know I've had friends who have maybe passed by an opportunity to go up a rung of the ladder because really it wasn't going to give them that much more money, and it just meant a lot more responsibility. So it's a slightly different outlook, I think, when you're in your 20s and 30s. But by age 40, I think women are beginning to realize that they are going to have to prioritize it. It's roughly about the same number of men, the same percentage of men and women who think that pensions are the top financial priority. And it's probably a sense of urgency as well now, because you're maybe looking back and going, well, actually, I've had this gap. It's fallen down a little bit. I haven't been prioritizing this. And now I really do need to do something. And maybe it's at this age that women again begin to focus a little bit on themselves. And instead of always pushing the children first, they're maybe thinking about trying to achieve some career goals. But by that point, maybe the pay gap's a little bit large, and the pensions pay gap is the pensions gender gap is also a little bit difficult and a little bit large. And it's really difficult to catch up at that early age because you're talking about putting a lot more money towards pensions, and that can be quite difficult because you're still living your life. You've still probably got teenagers at home or those children in their early 20s who are very reluctant to leave. So again, it's really, I think, quite difficult to catch up at that age, but certainly women are much more aware of the challenge in front of them.
So you say that it's hard to catch up, but it's not all bad news because there are steps that you can take.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really important to focus on that, because sometimes we can say, even when you get to 40, it's odd. You can think, well, I've not saved that much. There's no point. What am I doing this for? And I think that's probably maybe there is a different attitude you can take. There is still time to do something, and if you start saving at that age and saving a little bit more money with the magic of compound interest and the magic of just getting a really good regular savings pattern, it's amazing what you can achieve. So yeah, don't give up on pensions just because you've just had a rocky few years or rocky couple of decades. Think about what you can achieve. I think if women going forward, probably at that age, what can they do to really step up their savings journeys? The first thing is, I would probably say, show your pension a little bit of love. Get to know your pension, get to understand it a little bit, because maybe it's me, but I always think of it in a little closed box, and I'm really bit reluctant sometimes to lift up the lid and peek underneath. But I think it's really important to do that, just to get to know what you've got in there, where it is for a start off, where your money is, because you might have changed employers and have all, a number of different pensions, but how much money you've got and what you're saving. But you can also have a think about increasing that and taking advantage of what we call free money. Now, there's two really important sources of free money when it comes to pensions. One of them is your employer's contribution. So sometimes if you pay a little bit more money into your pension, your employer will also pay money into the pension as well. They will up their contributions as well. So go and ask your employer what the deal is. How does this work? If you increase your money, and by what percentage, how much more do you have to put in to get something from them? Because this is free money. They can't give it to you in any other format. They can't give it to you as a bonus or additional salary or another day's holiday. That's just not allowed. So think about how you can take advantage. And obviously you get tax relief on your pension contributions as well. So you pay more money, the government chips in as well. And all of those things mean that you can really go to save for your future. But I think just going back to what Charlene was saying earlier, and just to pick up on this again, Charlene, I think it's really important that households have a really frank conversation about pensions. And I think that can be it's quite a tricky conversation, because sometimes I'm going to generalize again here dreadfully, so please excuse me. But if the husband or the male partner might be earning more money than the female, and therefore, or one person could be earning more money than the other, and they're in a higher tax bracket, and therefore they get a bigger amount of tax relief because of that. And therefore it's easy to say, well, we'll prioritize their pension savings and make sure they save money into their pension because they get a bigger amount back from the government. But that does mean then that the other partners might not be able to contribute as much money into their pension. So I think that's quite a difficult juxtaposition to get round.
It is. I suppose I would come back to, I talk a lot about how you can eke a bit more out, or what financially on paper might be the best thing to do. And obviously, we do promote that. And if you think about it, as Rachel says, about tax relief, you might get a bit more bang for your buck if you are in a different tax bracket to your partner. However, I think, like you say, you have to be really frank about this, because I don't know how I would personally feel about the thought of asking my other half for basically an allowance. So it's about having those conversations. There is no one right or wrong way. There might be a financially slightly more efficient way of doing things, but you are in this partnership together, if we're talking about a household. And, there are little tricks and tips out there, like as you mentioned, compound interest. There's that myth that Einstein called it one of the wonders of the world. He did not. I don't believe that. I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but the sentiment is correct. So what do we mean about this? We mean money that you put away and you invest will hopefully grow, and long term history shows us that does happen. The compound bit is where the growth then also grows, and you get this kind of hopefully snowball good effect of the money you've put away. So even if you're not earning, you can still pay into your pension and get a tax relief bonus top up, or other people can pay into your pension for you if you don't have that spare cash, as we've talked about. That limit is up to something called £2,880. It gets topped up to £3,600 a year, thanks to tax relief, or £240 a month overall. So the earlier you start, the more chance you have and more time you have to benefit from the power of compound growth, as Rachel mentioned. Automate your investing. That would be another tip, I would say. So you're having these frank conversations, even if it's a little and often is obviously better than nothing. I think, I was talking to some colleagues about a separate issue, but we're talking about goals, and so many people look at something, or they feel like they've fallen behind compared to their peers or people they see on social media, and just think, well, there's no point in me bothering them. This gap's here. You might be living and breathing this pension gap in your relationship, in your household. But that doesn't mean you can't, like you say, do something about it or try and take some steps. So, the old adage, pay yourself first. You see your monthly income, whatever form that is coming in. If you can afford to put that little bit away, the earlier the better. But that doesn't mean that it's too late to get started. So as I went back to before, we talked about, you have a joint mortgage in your joint names. One person might have put a lot more equity into the house than the other, or they might be responsible for paying a bit more of that mortgage. So you have that joint conversation about mortgages. Pensions are your own individual pots, but you can still approach them as a kind of joint venture, if you like.
It's interesting you were talking about, you wouldn't want your partner to give you sort of an allowance. So, giving you money to put into your pension might feel like that. But of course, particularly I'm thinking if you're working part-time, what does tend to happen with women is that they'll say, right, I tell you what, you pay the bills, which are a steady thing. You know that is going to happen every week. You pay the electricity and maybe go halves on the mortgage. And I'll do things like cover the shoes that the kids need or the uniforms and things like that. But actually, if you were to say to your partner, right, looking at what I'm earning and what you're earning, you cover a bit more of the things that the kids are going to need so that I can put a bit more in my pension. And sometimes it is about putting yourself first. And that can feel really, really alien. And I really liked what you said, Rachel, about feeling like you'd put your pension in a box, because I do think that we kind of treat pensions as this alien thing. There's a disconnect. We don't really talk about it in terms of, this is the money that I'm putting aside now for future me. This is the money that I'm putting aside so that when I hit 55, 65, by the time probably I will be able to look at retiring, that I can go to the hairdresser and get those roots sorted out because they desperately need doing, or I can afford to help my kids with a deposit on the house. You're so caught up in the now that you forget about what you're going to need in the future. And I think, Charlene, certainly there are things that we can do in the finance sector to really talk to women and get them to engage in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just go back to that allowance point. I probably didn't explain myself very well. That, that is something for me to take away and talk about, like when you're in retirement, because of those different pots and what they might give you. So yeah, if we can do more to kind of have that joint discussion before, like you say, it means that when you get to retirement, what you want to spend your money on, you've already had that conversation. It feels less alien. I'm not, but absolutely, it is a lot. And I look to my own situation, like we don't actually have a joint bank account for our various own reasons, but we have that conversation about, right, this bit's sorted, this bit's sorted. So yeah, I'm not, underestimating how different that is. But yeah, back to our kind of responsibilities, the big one, and we talk about it a lot at Money Matters, and something that we do really strive to achieve, and hopefully we are making big roads here, is get rid of jargon. That goes for the investment industry as a whole. I think, as someone who loves pensions, I always think that they get slightly unfairly tainted with being seen as automatically complicated by some of the, financial services industry, people who perhaps are more familiar with investments, if you like. Because to me, and those basics that Rachel mentioned, they're not actually that difficult, okay? So start saving as soon as you can is a great principle. Keep those automated regular contributions, whether that's money from yourself or that free money Rachel mentioned, so the tax relief top up from the government, and if you are employed, what your employer will also pay in. So those kind of 2 or 3 things there. For us, it's let's really make a pledge to avoid any confusing technical jargon language. And if we actually focused on highlighting these key points, I think that would resonate with people a lot more, and it would feel less of this kind of all or nothing. Well, I might as well not do anything because I'm so far behind with my pension saving, blah, blah. Or, that it's actually just about how we can tick up people being able to achieve that financial independence. And I think, goals, we talked about goals and tangible priorities. Goals are great when you work with clients. So my background was in wealth management. That is exactly what you help people. As a good financial planner, your job is to help people visualize and think about their financial goals, well, actually their lifestyle goals. I should go a step back. I'll get advisors coming after me for this one. Their lifestyle goals first, and then you put a price on them and how you plan them. So you help people visualize, articulate, and then achieve their goals. So why can't we, in the industry, in the pensions world, actually kind of help talk, communicate in that way, so that actually really resonates with the people we're trying to help? So yeah, absolutely, we try and incorporate that to readers of Money Matters and our other content, listeners, but we've got big plans to do more, so watch that space on that one.
And one of the things I know that financial services, in fact, just everybody in general, is quite guilty of doing is thinking about how pensions work, putting together those sums about how you can create your pension, and thinking, well, you'll go from the bottom to the top in terms of your career, because men's careers very often, most of the time, will start at the bottom and go on a steady trajectory upwards, whereas women's careers, you're going to have a few ups and downs as you take some time out. And to that end, there are things, Rachel, that the government could do differently as well.
I think so, yes. I mean, the first thing when you think about how the government can tackle the gender pensions gap is really to tackle the pay gap. Now, I think over the last few years, they've done the gender pay gap, and the difference between what men and women are paid has massively reduced. It's reduced by over a quarter in the last 10 years. I was saying earlier that at the moment it's about 7% the difference. But if you go back to the start of the millennium, look back to 2000, it was 16%. So from where I'm coming from as someone in my 50s, I'm looking back going, we have achieved an awful lot. But certainly the government cannot be complacent. 7% is still really not right. For men and women doing the same job should get paid the same amount of money. It's as simple as that. So there is definitely more that they can do, and they've got to have the ambition to really close that, just to get it to zero. But there are other things that the government can do as well. Automatic enrolment is a really good example. Now that's been absolutely fundamental in getting more people starting to save earlier. And it's been really very, very useful. But they could do more. Instead of saying, well, we're not going to tackle this to age 22, they could reduce the age to 18 and to bring in that change. And also at the moment, you have minimum contributions you've got to pay in, but they're based on a band of earnings, which roughly runs from about 6,500 up to about 50,000. That's a little bit weird. So you don't count it on the very first pound of salary that you earn. So if you don't earn as much because you're in part-time work, then if you're taking a £6,000 off at the bottom before you even start working out how much pension contribution you've got, that you can automatically see how that's going to be squished together, and it's going to be much reduced. So especially for lower earners or part-time workers, if you've got that situation, you're looking at your pension contributions and you're counting it from the very first pound of salary onwards, then that must make a massive difference to your end retirement pot. So I think that's a real substantial change that the government should bring in and should work with employers to bring in over the next few years. And then just one last thing I would really like from the government is to stop speculation about changes to pensions. Now, over the last couple of years with the budget, we've had all sorts of rumours flying around about the government removing all the tax advantages to pensions, or some of them, or changing them. And really, we just need someone to say, no, enough is enough. Stop this speculation, knock it on the head, and give us some security. So what we're doing with pensions is we're asking people to save, to lock their money up, to save for the long term. And if we're doing that, we need to give them the backing and the security and the knowledge that the rules aren't going to be massively changed, that the goalposts aren't going to suddenly shift, and what they've been saving for isn't really what they're going to get at the end of the day. That's not right. It's just not playing fair. So we need to stop this sort of speculation because people just need security. We're asking a lot of them, and the government should really get behind that and give a lot back to people as well.
Yeah, I mean, we know that we're asking a lot of people. We're asking a lot of ourselves. Sometimes you get to the end of the month and there's not enough money, and there's absolutely no way that you can put money into a pension and prioritize future you because the current you just doesn't have any spare cash. Life is messy, and it's not easy to have everything figured out, especially when you're in your early 20s. And of course, we know from the numbers that if you can do just that little bit more in your early 20s, if we can now talk to our kids, talk to, our friends, and just really get them to prioritize this early, then that is really important. And storytelling, what you were saying, Charlene, about visualization, about not just thinking of it as a pension pot that you have to lock away, but thinking of it as future you, future holidays, future hairdressing appointments, whatever it may be. It can make a big difference. Look, thank you both so much for joining us for this episode.
Thank you. It's been really good. It's been really interesting to have this chat. So
yeah, thanks, Danny. I think for me, like, pensions don't always need to be really exciting or even sexy, but they are not something to fear. Not everyone's got it figured out. That's okay. But, the more we can do and have these chats to try and give people some takeaways, the better, in my view.
Yeah, and that's it. It's a small step, just listening to this podcast. So don't be disheartened, don't be intimidated, and hopefully you've heard something which has made you think, has made you feel a bit more empowered. Look, we've got loads of articles on our AJ Bell Women and Investing Hub, which is on the main AJ Bell website. Hopefully you've already signed up to our community and you get our monthly newsletter where we let you know everything that is going on. And perhaps you also follow us on social media at AJ Bell Money Matters. So you'll have seen all the fantastic content from the launch of this report, which we hosted at the Affordable Art Fair on Hampstead Heath. I know a number of you grabbed tickets to the fair. If you're interested in art and investment, do go back and listen to our pod from a year ago with Jennifer Connor. And you might also be interested in our next podcast, which will be talking about alternative investments. We'll be chatting about gold with the Royal Mint. But for now, that is it. Thank you, ladies, for your time and insight.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for listening.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.